Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. C-11, remember that? It's that controversial bill which would allow the government to control the flow of information online and would enforce Canadian content restrictions. Well, C-11 has recently passed the House of Commons with NDP and Bloc Québécois support. The bill now sits with the Senate, which has indicated that Canadians should not expect a speedy approval. They plan to take their time. And let's hope they do, because there's a lot of concern with this legislation. There are concerns that this is government overreach, granting the government power to override free speech online. YouTube creators are concerned with government manipulating algorithms to prioritize Canadian content, thereby affecting their visibility on that platform. And speaking of Canadian content, well, that requirement could even extend to pornography. Would that mean that somewhere in a government office, a government employee would actually have to start reviewing porn from their office to make sure that there's enough of it produced in Canada? Kind of sounds like it. So how would C-11 impact you and your online consumption? How would this impact content production? Will the Senate provide any meaningful amendments to the bill? Will this bill usher in a Big Brother-esque era? Well, joining me now to share his expertise and views on the matter is Peter Menzies, a former vice chair for the Canadian Radio Television Commission, the CRTC. He's an author and also a senior fellow with the Macdonald Laurier Institute. Thank you, Peter, so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Tanya.
So what, on the onset, was the purpose of C-11, or what is the purpose of C-11?
The stated purpose of C-11 when previous minister Stephen Guilbeault began talking about it was to get money from web giants. That was pretty much it. That streaming companies are taking a lot of subscription revenue from Canadians, and the government wanted to make sure this went back into their system, the old CRTC system, in which cable companies provide a percentage of their revenue to support the production of Canadian films, certified Canadian content through a number of funds. The fact of the matter was, my perspective at least, is that by leaving Netflix and others outside the system, we'd just seen 80% growth over the last decade in the Canadian film and television industry. Things are going great, right, in terms of that. So, in fact, from my point of view, the objectives of the Broadcasting Act were being met. From the government's point of view and those campaigning for it, they were afraid that their old system was no longer secure.
So when you say online streaming giants, you mentioned Netflix. This would include like Disney Plus, all these online streaming platforms. People seem to have left cable and gone to these kind of a la carte providers. Is that correct? This is what a streaming giant is?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, cable's now down to about 50% of households. In terms of connectivity, more and more people are cord cutters. That said, cable companies are reaching a lot of people through streaming. And as you alluded to in your introduction, that would include YouPorn.
Okay, and we're going to get into that later, because that was an interesting bit that I caught over the weekend before we record this show.
Yeah, lots of giggling about that one.
Lots of giggling, and we'll giggle later. So what are your main concerns then with the bill? I mean, we only have about a minute and a half to commercial. We can continue on the next segment. But what kind of stands out as your biggest concern?
Actually, the biggest concern is the number of things that the legislation leaves undefined. It's non-specific. It's very sweeping in that it grants the CRTC global dominion over the internet. There's no boundaries to where its authority can go. It leaves things such as social media undefined. It leaves Canadian content to be redefined. It leaves who this will apply to and who it won't apply to, whether it will apply to you, for instance, or whether it would not. Whether companies that make more money or make less money. If it applied to you, what would be the restrictions on your content? What would be the behaviors expected of you? So the big concern is that there's so much left to be decided that Parliament won't get to decide. Only the CRTC will.
My goodness. And for our viewers' knowledge, the CRTC is not an elected body. You're the former vice chair. It's an appointed body by the government, correct?
Yes, yeah. There's a chair, two vice chairs, one for telecom, one for broadcasting. and 6 regional commissioners, and all are cabinet appointees.
So this is a very important bill because we again, we're sort of almost handing over the rights to a lot of things to an unelected body. And I think that's an important point to mention. We're going to pick up this discussion in just a few moments. Peter, in our previous segment, you mentioned that one of the biggest concerns was that there is a lot of ambiguity, or there are a lot of terms that are left undefined. The language is very broad, and I've looked at it. Why has the language been left so broad, so that it could even include personal self-produced content? Why do you think it was left like that?
I think it's been left that broad because they don't want to have to amend it in the future. I don't think their intention, I think they're sincere about saying their intention is not to regulate our social media posts, but still they're giving the CRTC the power to do that inside the legislation. So they're paving the way for future interventions into those areas, which is a big mistake, I think, in terms of that. They may naively think, well, that's okay for now, but in the future, somebody will show up to them in front of the CRTC and say, hey, you know that authority you have there? I want you to exercise it because it will make my life better. And the CRTC will, if there's a good argument, they'll say yes, and away you'll go. And there's no democratic thing in there in terms of that. People do get to participate in public processes, but I mean, how many people are, have tagged the crtc.gc.ca for their daily updates of news and what they need to intervene in and how to intervene and that sort of stuff.
Maybe after watching this show, more people will. But again, it was a very good point that there's so much left unsaid. But I recall with the previous iteration, I believe, which was C-10, the government did receive ample feedback from consumers, from citizens. And then, of course, the election killed that last bill because legislation dies once there's an election call. Why didn't the government hear? There was a lot of complaint. Why hasn't the government incorporated some of those suggestions or assuage those concerns?
Well, they did try to, having denied in the C-10 debate that there were any concerns about freedom of speech, they did try to address them in this one, but they kind of said, no, we won't in one paragraph, and then said, yes, we can in another. So I'm not sure we got anywhere. I think we got somewhere with the idea that people's speech itself would be suppressed.
Right.
Their expression, though, is still compromised. And, being able to listen freely is as important as being able to speak freely sometimes too, right? So having somebody control what you can listen to is necessarily still an invasion in your ability to communicate freely.
Okay, so what kind of content will be regulated? And again, I appreciate it's vague, but we've heard concerns that YouTube is going to be regulated or TikTok. The government at various times has said that this content will or will not be regulated. Do you have any insights as to what you can predict will be?
Well, audio and video is what they're focusing on. They've left out the written word. So audio and video for commercial purpose. How big a commercial purpose that is again left undefined, but it's up to the CRTC. Could be that you make, $500 a week. Could be you make $1,000 a month. Could be $100 million a year, right? Wherever they're going to draw the line. So they'll have to go through a process and decide that. But definitely YouTube. Definitely, I would think TikTok. Any of the big ones, Disney Plus, Netflix. All of those. Netflix. That's one of the weird things about it is that they define Netflix as broadcasting,
right?
And it's not. It's a video store, right? That's what it is.
And it is. You know what? I was an early days Netflix subscriber where they used to send you DVDs. It was like the lazy video store person's mode of watching entertainment. I was that person.
Yeah, they did. They're not killing broadcasting, but they did kill video stores.
They did. I remember I used to get a DVD. People don't remember those days. I do. I was, stay-at-home mom raising young children, and I would get a DVD delivered every few days that I wanted one. It was great. Now, obviously, things have changed quite a bit. But so it's interesting you mentioned that. We're broadcast. We're a network. I don't equate ourselves with Netflix because that is not a broadcast platform.
Yeah, but if you're making money, if if you're getting paid, if you have more than a certain number of employees, you're now going to be captured by C-11. And for all I know, the Broadcasting Act says the CRTC has to make sure that which it regulates is of good standards. So perhaps you'll be subject to the Canadian Broadcasting Standards Council codes as well, which is sort of voluntary, but kind of not.
Okay.
The penalties are basically public shaming, so it's not like it's all that bad, but it does put a kind of cloak over everything, right?
Okay, we're going to continue this discussion. We have to cut for commercial. We'll continue this discussion in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on C-11 with Peter Menzies, a former vice chair for the CRTC. Peter, before the break, we started getting into the discussion of penalties because there are even financial penalties associated if you're not going to meet the requirements with this new piece of legislation. Can you please share with us what some of the repercussions could be, and at what point would they be enacted? At what point, if you're a YouTube content creator, say you're giving an opinion on say C-11 on a piece of legislation, what would be required to meet Canadian content, and at what point could there be a fine or some kind of penalty levied?
Well, a lot of those things are going to be up to the CRTC, but as things currently operate, basically goes to Canadian Broadcast Standards Council, which regulates speech on the CRTC's behalf. The CRTC is always quick to say we don't regulate speech, but they do. It's really kind of all it does overall in terms of that. We can argue about whether it's justifiable or otherwise, but the Canadian Broadcasting Standards Council sets limits on what people can say and how broadcasters have to behave and that sort of stuff. That consists primarily of public shaming. You have to confess your sin on air and promise not to do it again, essentially, and let people know that the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council ruled against you in terms of that. Most things are settled just by talking to viewers. But then the CRTC's powers. It could go through right to site blocking. If somebody was very controversial, refused to comply, that sort of thing, they could order the ISPs, internet service providers, your internet company, to block the website.
So you said very controversial.
I expect.
Like on an issue, controversial on an issue?
Yeah, the manner in which they're expressing themselves. These things can get defined. You'll see more of this coming up in the online harms legislation that they're going to introduce later this year. But it depends how they define hate speech, for instance.
Right. Because
hate speech is now defined in the criminal code, but they obviously a number of people feel that that's insufficient, and they want new definitions of. And some of the arguments have been, when you hurt somebody's feelings, when you offend somebody, being offensive. Being offensive is kind of what freedom of speech is all about, right?
Right.
It's very easy to tolerate things that you don't find offensive.
I'm offended many times a day, both by my children by the stores and everything.
Yeah, by the time I've listened to my morning news at 6 a.m., I've been offended 4 or 5 times in the first 10 minutes of the day. But that's where tolerance comes in, and being, sharing citizens, understanding that we all have different points of view.
So for most of our viewers, we're having, I'd say generally higher level discussion, but they'll say, well, how is this going to impact me? How will we as a consumer or Canadian watching online and through streaming services, how will we be impacted if there will be a curation of content now on Netflix and YouTube, et cetera?
Well, what you'll be seeing is Canadian content pushed at you first. It won't be right now whatever content you are preferring. The algorithms pick up on and feeds you more of it, right? So if I like romantic comedies on Netflix, it's showing me more romantic comedies. If I like action adventure films, it's showing me my first choice wave are going to be action adventure films. In this way, the CRTC will decide what you prefer. And the first thing it'll be showing you is Canadian shows. It's called discoverability. I don't find it difficult to discover Canadian shows on Netflix. I go to the search tool and I type in Canadian, and boom, there's Canadian stuff all over the place. But that's not good enough, I guess, for the folks behind C-11, and they want to be able to push their stuff out first, which of course means somebody else gets suppressed. So when it comes to YouTube, that's a big problem for Canadian YouTubers who are very successful. In fact, among the most successful in the world. And one of the reasons they're successful is because their content goes beyond our borders, right? The CRTC system is all based on hiding Canada from the world, protecting Canada from the world inside the little walled garden, is the old phrase. Whereas the internet is about letting the whole world in, right? So C-11 is going to work harder not to let the whole world in and keep Canada in front. So we can debate that, but for the YouTubers, if they get, unless they're certified Canadian content, which most of them aren't right now, and that's going to cost you a lot to get that, you're going to get suppressed in favor of the certified, which is going to impact your earnings.
I'd love to see how Jordan Peterson will respond, because I'm sure he's one of our biggest exports on YouTube content. Anyhow, we'll have to pick up this discussion in just a few moments. Welcome back. I'm chatting with Peter Menzies, a former vice chair of the CRTC. Peter, we're talking about C-11, we're talking about Canadian content, and of course, you know, we alluded to this in my opener, but pornography could also be, the production of pornography could also be impacted by C-11. You know, we think of Pornhub, which is a Montreal-based company, I think the largest, I don't know, purveyor of pornography in the world. I don't know what one should say. They are regularly credited with more views than TikTok and Netflix. Should we expect then more Canadian content from Pornhub? How would that even happen?
Well, it does right now in the CRTC system. There's, you know, on cable channels, there's adult channels, right? And it's all regulated by the CRTC. It includes described video, closed captioning, all those sorts of things that are standard for everything else. And it's been that way since the 1990s. The cable companies wanted to get into the porn business because satellite was very popular, right? So they made a lot of money at it. And then when it went online, they made less money. So I don't think there's any doubt that they will include that. And in the past, companies have been sanctioned by the CRTC for insufficient Canadian content.
So what would that mean? That the actors aren't Canadian? It's not produced physically on this land?
Yeah, it's a complex formula, and it includes actors, producers, the company that's doing it, writers. You know, the heavy script writing. Anyway, sorry, but the production values, the percentage of people involved in the production that are Canadian.
So already,
yeah.
So already there exists, because you suggest that again on, or you suggest that on broadcast, on networks and cable companies, they have pornographic content. They have certain dedicated channels. So there already is somebody who currently surveys the pornography landscape to make sure that there is enough Canadian content. So their role might just further be expanded to include Pornhub and all these online streaming services.
Pretty much, yeah. It'll just move to expand that, and then it'll. Again, I imagine through discoverability, the first stuff that shows up on your screen when you go on would be Canadian.
I can't get my head around that my tax dollars would go to somebody who's going to sit in an office and watch porn all day. I scratch my head.
Well, when I was at the CRTC, we once had to grant relief to a company in Montreal that was having difficulty finding anybody to sit and do that all day and supply the described video. Right, which is for the people who are sight impaired, so they can hear it but they can't see it, so somebody has to describe it. 7 hours over and over every day.
Well, I'm glad that there isn't a lineup.
Very difficult. Yeah, it was a difficult role to fill.
I'm glad that there's a lineup there isn't a lineup for people to fill that role. That makes me feel very good. So. How do you think consumers will react? Let's say this passes through the Senate. Well, first of all, I should ask you, do you think there will be any meaningful legislation or any meaningful amendments from the Senate? They said they're going to take their time.
I'm hopeful that there could be a couple of recommended amendments from the Senate. I don't know that that'll make any difference in the end. I hope that there's more debate, which gets more people engaged, because there's a big segment of people. When Canadian content was first brought in, that was about bringing Canadians who were being left outside a system into it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if there was any harm, anybody's access was reduced. It was American singers and songwriters and shows and that sort of stuff, and it made no real difference to them commercially. But this makes a huge difference. There are 100,000 Canadians earning money by producing content for YouTube. 25 to 30,000 of them it's their full-time job. There are some streamers on there that have billions of views, that are extremely popular internationally. So there's a real harm that can be done. It's not like, and it's not even just sort of collateral damage. You're pitting one system, which is a regulatory-based system, against another system, which is a free market-based system, and you're picking a winner, right? So do you really want to do that? I think that's something to be considered. And also, do they really realize how much the younger generation, the younger millennial generation, considers the internet to be its thing?
Right.
It's sort of a generational identifier. And what are you doing bringing in all these okay boomer rules about, how you're going to govern my content? I think it'll be a real problem.
Okay, Peter, thank you so much for joining me. Very excellent insights, and we'll have to keep our eye on this.
Okay, thanks very much for the opportunity.